All right, you curiouser and curiouser Herle Burly-ites, we have what I think is a fascinating pod for you today, because our guest today can accurately be described as a political renaissance man. His name is David Pepper. David Pepper is a Yale-educated lawyer. He's a former politician serving on city council in Cincinnati and as a member of Hamilton County, Ohio Board of Commissioners. He's the former chairman of the Ohio Democratic Party, stepping down after the 2020 elections. And get this, he's also an author, hailed as one of the best political thriller writers on the scene for his fiction. Bill Clinton. Yes, Bill Clinton gushed about his latest novel. I know it's always dangerous to use the word gush talking about Bill Clinton, but nonetheless gushed about his latest novel, The Voter File. We'll explore a little about David's backstory, but all of that is not really why we wanted to talk to him here today. His latest book is a work of nonfiction called Laboratories of Autocracy. In it, David argues that the greatest threat to American democracy is not the big lie or January 6th and the limo-lunging behaviours of Donald Trump. It's not the antics of federal politicians like Marjorie Taylor Greene and Jim Jordan. Rather, his thesis is that it's the anonymous, often corrupt politician operating in statehouse after statehouse across the country who pose the greatest dangers to democracy. Politicians who hack away daily at the core principles and place American democracy at its greatest peril since the Jim Crow era. We'll talk about all that and David's thoughts in the book about how America can fight back. David Pepper, such a pleasure to have you on the Herle Burly today. I have to say, I found the book really enlightening in the way that this has strategically been done by the Republicans.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be with you, and I appreciate the praise of the book, although a lot of it's pretty sobering. But as you say, I also try and get to the point where I say what we can do about it, which is the reason I wrote the book was honestly, it's complicated. The other side has a really deep, thought-through strategy that is way below the surface of how most Americans, let alone Canadians, think about our politics. And so we're way behind. And I wrote the book. The subtitle, I guess, is A Wake-Up Call from Behind the Lines. It's basically me saying everyone needs to figure this out quick, because if we don't, they're going to win. So I appreciate your interest in helping me amplify the message.
Hey, where do we find you today?
I'm in Cincinnati. But as I said,
great town. I love Cincinnati.
Yeah, I'm looking out over the river. As Sarah Palin once said, I can see Kentucky from my home or from my office. But I mentioned I'm excited. I will be in a car tomorrow driving to Georgian Bay, where I have not been in a couple of years because of the pandemic, and I spent most of my childhood in the summer up there. So we have a very, I wouldn't be alive today if it weren't for Georgian Bay, because my grandparents, one from Rochester and one from Cincinnati, met up there in like the 1920s. So we've been going there ever since.
Beautiful. All right. You're an honorary Canadian.
I am. And I'm excited to get there.
Outstanding. All right. Your book is so timely, David, with the Roe versus Wade decision of the Supreme Court. Essentially, your book says, and it resonated a lot with me as a Canadian, your book says that the Democrats and the media focus on the big races, the presidency, the Senate, the Congress, the House of Representatives, and maybe governors. And as a Canadian viewer of American politics, that's what I focus on.
Yeah.
And it's not that the Republicans don't focus on that, but it's that the other side, and it's not even just Republicans, it's the far right of American politics, have realized how much power is wielded at the state level. And they've focused their efforts there. And this has now, it was damaging enough before, but now we have a Supreme Court that is gutting federal powers and giving them to the states, as we saw today with the Environmental Protection Agency ruling out of the Supreme Court. So now these state legislatures become even more powerful with the stacked Supreme Court than they were before.
Right.
How many states are in this position where they're dominated, where they've been taken over and dominated?
I guess I should sit around and categorize it, but on the cover of my book, I basically go through, I have the red ones that are basically the laboratories of autocracy as I describe them. It's dozens. And here's a point I didn't make in my book as much as I believe now. And I have a second book that explains this. What is driving this is the understanding by the far right, not every Republican, but the far right, the Koch brothers, those who want to get rid of Roe v. Wade. What's driving it all is that they understand they are in the deep minority in this country. and that if we had elections on their issues that they care about, they would always lose. And so the reason they have grabbed at basically the point of the book is to say our democracy is shaped in the state houses. That's where the rules are written. That's where the gerrymandering is done. So this far right outfit, this set of outfits, they understand in a fair election we would lose. Our point of view is two in the minority. But if we get into these state houses, we can create spaces where minority worldviews can be locked into place through rigged elections, gerrymandering, voter suppression. And what we really need to help make that happen is a Supreme Court which will uphold those horrible anti-majoritarian laws. And that's what they're doing. So the common pattern is Roe v. Wade, gun laws, anti-environmental stuff. These are things that if you had an open, fair election on, the more progressive side would win. Most people in this country support Roe v. Wade. It's not even close. Support common sense gun laws, want to do something about climate change. This side knows that. And so what they're doing is they have figured out, well, we're not going to quit to get what we want done. We are subverting democracy in multiple states, which allows us to accomplish our agenda so long as we have a Supreme Court that will uphold the crazy laws we pass in states. That 1-2 punch is what's happening over and over and over again. And the reason I wrote my book is Democrats too often aren't engaging at that level. We think, well, if we win this federal elections, everything's fine. What we're learning is, no, it's not fine. The other side is battling basically by themselves in the states, and we sit around and try and win federal. And here's the bottom line wake-up call. Even when we win the federal game that we think we're supposed to win, we're still losing. And that's a sign that your battle plan is not the right plan. Right. But yeah, the state houses have become the way for them to usher in and cement into place a minority worldview and jam it on the majority. And it's frankly working to a T right now.
Right. So let's just take Ohio because you know it probably the best. What are the powers that the state legislature has? And you would suggest that nobody knows who these people are, and I believe you, because nobody knows who the members of the Ontario legislature are either.
Exactly.
So what are the powers that they have that become relevant in this kind of situation?
So I call these state houses the Achilles heel of politics because they have a lot of power, but no one knows who the heck these people are. And because with gerrymandering, it's so rigged, even when you figure out who they are, you can't get rid of them. And that amount of power with no accountability is very dangerous. So what power do they have? Except for a couple issues like the military and foreign policy, every state house, basically its footprint includes almost every issue we care about in politics. You know, economy, taxes, regulation, climate, schools, healthcare, their quality, what's taught. And what are the big picture issues in politics? Roe v. Wade, guns, on and on and on. If you want to ban books, you can go to a state house. If you want to ban abortion, go to a state house. If you want to put guns everywhere, go to a state house. So essentially, in that state, they are the first movers on almost every issue that we care about and that this far right that I talked about cared about. But here's the kicker. They also control and really shape most of the democracy in that state for both federal and state elections.
Yeah, walk us through this part of it.
What's that? Yeah.
Walk us through this part of it.
Yeah, they determine how you vote, when you vote. Do you have a month? Do you have a day? How do you register? How do you get knocked off the rolls? Can you use a drop box? We just saw yesterday, Missouri just banned drop boxes. Can you vote early?
Sorry, can I stop you? I don't think Canadians know what a drop box is.
Oh, I'm sorry. Drop boxes are a way that a lot of states move to early voting by mail, by absentee ballot late in the last decade, and people really prefer it.
Yeah, in most states, it's now the dominant form of voting, right?
Yeah, people prefer it. Everyone prefers it. It used to be seniors. Now it's everybody. Well, in the pandemic, especially because the mail was so screwed up, a lot of states said, our elections offices are going to set up a place where you can drop off your ballot without even a stamp, and it goes right to the elections office, not in the mail, which was all screwed up. So millions of people use drop boxes. Millions of those people happen to be minorities. Guess what? Now they don't like drop boxes because minorities voted for Biden using drop boxes. as I put out on the whiteboard today, by the way, if anyone's on Twitter, follow me at David Pepper. I always am putting out whiteboards to explain this stuff. There have been drop boxes for years in Utah and Alaska. No one even cared. But the minute black voters used drop boxes in Atlanta, in Detroit, now we want to get rid of them because they were used by voters that they don't like. But the point is, these states not only control every issue we care about, but they also shape democracy. They write the rules of our elections, which shape in the end who votes. But they also, as we talked about, they draw the district lines, not just for Congress, but for themselves. And one other thing, they also play a role in the Electoral college process that determines who the president is. Now, Donald Trump figured that out too late. That's why he had to do what he did on January 6th. But they shape that. And the final power they have, this is more detail, but we have an hour, so I'll go into it. They also have a lot of power to run over other officials. Governors of our state are much better known than these state house members. But I go through in the book, they have enough power over the budget and other things. They can run over officials that are far better known. So these extremists,
they can override the governor, can they not? They can override the governor.
They can override. They can bully. Like, we had a governor who tried to do the right thing on COVID for a while. They just wouldn't let him do it. And over time, he just quit. And because, so and by the way, these statewide officials, one of the things I go through, and this is another, we haven't got to yet, by rigging their elections and suppressing the votes of those who oppose them, they've created little fortresses of total unaccountability. I go through it in the book. Almost not a single person in the Ohio State House faces anything close to a competitive election. So they're immune.
I need to stop you. And I want you to take a step back because as I said to you, I think before when we were talking before.
Okay. Sorry, I get all fired up.
No, it's good. It's just that gerrymandering's been gone from Canada for 50 years.
Lucky you.
And so I don't think my listeners fully maybe will understand what you're talking about. So let me summarize and then you jump in. The politicians themselves write the boundaries for the state legislative districts. And they have crafted boundaries that make a Republican majority undefeatable, essentially. Even if you lose the popular vote in the state, you're still going to get a majority of Republicans because of the way that they have drafted very precisely based on market research, presumably, and voting patterns, the boundaries. So these guys get these jobs, and no matter what they do, they won't lose their job because they're in such a diehard Republican district.
Correct.
So did I get that right?
Yeah, you did. And so it's not, so I go through this in the book. They have locked in minority rule even when the majority votes the other way. So in Wisconsin and Ohio, Pennsylvania, Michigan especially, in 2018, those voters chose by quite a large amount a Democrat for their state house. In Wisconsin, by 9 points, they won a Democrat. The legislature was 2-1 Republican, despite that majority wanting the other way. So this is a system Putin would admire. They literally have locked into place minority rule, even when the voters go the other way. But there's one other piece to that. So it empowers minority rule. But secondly, and this is the part I didn't even appreciate until I wrote the book and went through the research. It's not only that they're enshrining minority rule and the majority can't express its will, which is pretty awful. They've come up with a system where to a person, none of them are worried about an election. None of them are accountable. I go through this in the book. Over 10 years, almost not a single Ohio Republican legislator has ever worried about their election. We're talking about entire careers spent in districts they cannot lose. And what does that do? And this gets back to running over statewide officials. That lack of accountability has removed every incentive for the kind of behavior we expect from public servants. You know, you're supposed to deliver good public outcomes, right? Then you get reelected. If you're reelected no matter what, public outcomes no longer matter. Your schools can be terrible. Your infrastructure can be awful. I'm trying not to swear, although you said I was allowed to. Your wages can go down. Your healthcare could suck. I'll go there. Get reelected because it doesn't matter. There used to be, in a close district, there's an incentive against being an extremist.
Right.
You want to be for mainstream issues. Well, you wouldn't be against Roe v. Wade in such a district because Roe v. Wade is the majority view in Ohio. But once you're in an extreme district that's guaranteed to win, your biggest worry is that you'll lose in the primary where someone in your own party can run against you. How would they run against you? They'd go to your extreme. So you have all these incentives that we think lead to good behavior in this world without accountability lead to the worst behavior. And that's why if you're watching America from Canada or if you're in America watching, the reason the spiral is always going down is because all these incentives are always incentivizing the worst behavior. But going back to the point about running over statewide officials, these people are so unaccountable, and a governor of Ohio does face a general election that it always sort of, what's the term? It just devolves to the lowest common denominator, which is these extremists in the statehouse. They know they cannot lose. They don't care what the governor thinks. They're going to do what they want. And so going back to the bigger picture, what we have is state houses with control over every issue that can lock themselves in to being unaccountable no matter what they do. And that is the Laboratory of Autocracy model I describe. And that is what is crushing democracy. That is what it's putting into place. Roe v. Wade is popular in Ohio. Getting rid of abortion rights with no exceptions isn't only not popular, it's like 5% of the people. The gun laws they are passing are 5% of gun owners support them. But because they're in these little fortresses of unaccountability and they can run over the governor, all of it happens and there's nothing anyone can do about it. And so, yeah, that's why if you are for something really unpopular, if you're the NRA, if you're one of these right to life extreme groups, if you're the Koch brothers and you want to destroy any ability to do something like climate change, these state houses have emerged as the perfect institutions. You don't go to Congress. You don't go to Mitch McConnell. You go to a state house because they'll get it done. And by the way, and I use a laboratory for a reason.
McConnell got you your Supreme Court justices. Yeah, that was his role.
He's playing his, and McConnell understands all of this. What did they do when Trump, McConnell, and Paul Ryan were in charge for 2 years in Washington? Nothing. Because they knew that most of what they need to get done was happening in states, and they didn't want to embrace this controversial stuff. They just cut taxes and pushed through judges. They know Mitch McConnell. You remember, this is insider baseball probably, but Mitch McConnell's in a big fight with a Florida Republican senator because that Republican senator tried to announce what their agenda is. And he said, don't talk about that. He knows that their agenda is really unpopular. And if it's really a bad issue, they are much better off getting it done in states where no one knows who these people are, where Mitch McConnell and others can say, well, we're not doing that. And where even when they figure it out, they can't get him out of office because of gerrymandering. And that's why 90% of the advance of these conservative causes is happening to state house level. And the design of our government, unless you get really bold, it'll keep happening. And so my book is a call on people to get bold quickly. And to understand that we're 30 years behind the other side's plan.
Right. Herle Burly-ites, if you know me personally, or if you've been listening to either of our podcasts for any length of time, you know I love a good story. It's one of the reasons I'm such good friends with Scott Reed, who spins a yarn with the best of them. And we're coming now to the last two parts of a story I've been telling about TELUS's environmental, social, and governance commitments. Yes, TELUS is our presenting sponsor, but the reason I'm happy to tell it is this. It's a story that rises above words to actions. What gets measured gets done is one of TELUS's corporate mantras. They measure, act, and then publicly disclose their performance across all ESG metrics, because measurement and transparency are critical to getting any real work done in this space. It's not just TELUS saying that. It's the basis of a new report by PwC, released just last month, which outlines how Canada can improve its performance across economic, environmental, and social policy objectives to help meet UN Sustainable Development Goals. There's a lot in there, but here's a key part of the story and how the logic unfolds. Our government can play a central role in accelerating the standardization and regulation of ESG reporting. Regulated reporting drives the private sector's adoption of ESG best practices, and that is what leads to more meaningful action, above and beyond so many greenwashed words and empty gestures. I'll wrap up this story next week, Herle Burly-ites, with why ESG is becoming increasingly important for companies looking to create more value across all stakeholders. But for now, know this. TELUS, a company that's always been driven by social purpose, leads in this space. And you can find evidence of that, transparently reported evidence, in their sustainability and ESG report at telus.com/sustainability. You mentioned this conversation a couple of times, and you mention it repeatedly in the book, that once you get these gerrymandered districts, then you need to get, then the forces that are driving this from the right want to get the incentive systems right. What do you mean by getting the incentive systems right?
I go back, I was in office, you mentioned. When I was in office, I thought, hey, I was in a county that was 50-50, Cincinnati, Hamilton County. And so I thought, okay, if I want to get reelected, I need to go do some good work and be able to talk about my results. If I work with someone from the other party, it's good for me because then people who are in the middle will think that guy's pretty good. He's not just of his party. I don't want to be corrupt. That would cost me my office. There are certain incentives in a robust democracy. That's the whole point. You get reelected because you do things that most people agree with because you're representing well. Your public outcomes, I reduced foreclosures. I lifted healthcare. Every one of those incentives in a world with no accountability, which we are stuck with in dozens of states, is flipped on its head. And there is an incentive to be more extreme. There's an incentive to cut deals with private players because they reward you and you'll never lose. And a lot of the deals you cut are undermining public outcomes. I don't know the situation in Canada. They are giving away public school money to private online school scams. Our schools in Ohio were fifth 15 years ago. Now they're in the mid-20s. The money is going from these public schools to the big donors, to the Republicans who run these for-profit scams. They get rewarded by that donor, and the people back home whose schools are falling apart can't even get rid of them and don't even know. So you have all these incentives flipped on their head, and that's why I go through it in Ohio. So I'm a very proud Ohioan. I go through in the book. I was named most likely to be president of the Cincinnati Board of Tourism in law school. Okay, when I was in college, people would say, "You're from the Midwest." I'm like, "Oh no, I'm from Ohio. What are you talking about?" Well, I go through in the book. This great state that I bragged about all the way through my childhood, the results are plummeting because these legislatures are basically incentivized to give the public assets away to the private players to be as close to corrupt as they can be and get away with it. And some of them don't get away with it. They get busted all the time. And so all the incentives are backwards. So, and this is, by the way, long-term, how I think we get out of this mess. Endemic to these rigged, undemocratic state houses is corruption. The stories, and I tell a few in my book, are shocking about how bad it is. And I think the Democrats in these states who are smart enough to focus on the results of that corruption, people freezing to death in Texas because they privatized the energy grid, 4 days of school a week in Kansas because they gave away so much of the public school money, plummeting results. It's kind of the same reason that Putin's army is so hollow. Corruption hollows out public assets. That's what's happening in all these states. So all of it ties together. And it's all because these incentives motivating these politicians are all wrong. And here's the worst part. We have term limits in a lot of states like Ohio. We're talking now about entire generations where their entire career has been spent in this broken system. They don't know what a real election looks like. They're scared to death of ever facing one. So that's all they've known is a non-democratic system where they're in power. And that's why it's so hard to pull them back from it. It's all they've known. And the one thing they know, having been, extremists with terrible public outcomes, the one thing that those who are smart enough to know is if they ever had a real democracy, they would all lose. They know it. That's why they fight so hard to keep gerrymandering and to keep suppressing the vote. If they ever faced a 50-50 district with someone like me running against them saying, look how corrupt you are, look how schools are falling, they would lose. So to protect their power, they just keep suppressing democracy as much as they can.
Another part of this story is the fact that it largely happens in the dark. There's simply not enough robust local journalism to make citizens aware of what their legislators are doing and to hold them accountable to their voters. This is a problem everywhere in democracy. In what ways have you noticed the devolution of this over time?
Yeah, it's a huge problem. It is. So again, the lack of transparency of statehouse is key to the Laboratories of Autocracy approach I talk about. No one knows who these people are. I didn't know who they were, and I was a very educated young person. I thought, oh, there's some little mini Congress up there. I don't know what they're doing. And that was when we had more coverage. So every time a local small town paper dies, that's the end of the coverage of that individual office holder, and they're dying everywhere. The bigger papers have been consolidating so that the even their statehouse bureaus are much smaller. So maybe you get a story on the budget. Maybe you get a story on one crazy law, but only every once in a while does it break through. There's even more effects than that. Newspapers dying means there are fewer columnists with the experience to call out nonsense. Hey, that's a really bad gerrymander. Well, these columnists are the most expensive people, these papers, they're gone. The editorial, when I used to sit down to try and get an endorsement from newspapers, I'd sit down in front of an editorial board of 5 or 6 people. Many of these editorial boards of the bigger papers are down to one person, if they even have one. So the institutional expertise and knowledge to say, here's what the news that you are reading about means. This is really bad. That's gone too. So the basic coverage is gone. And by some states are down, I put this in the book, to 3 or 4 reporters for the entire statehouse coverage that maybe trickles back to a few of the big papers. And what does this, again, incentivize? First, go to state houses to pass your bad laws. You will unlikely have coverage like you would in Washington. Number 2, put 20 laws forward at once, because they'll never cover all of them. Maybe they'll cover 1 or 2 or 3 of those laws, but they'll never get to the other 17. There won't even be a story on it. There's only one reporter. And this is your
version of Steve Bannon's flood the zone with shit.
Yes, they are flooding. Or Donald Trump's throw ketchup on the wall. They are throwing this shit all over these state houses. And I've seen it myself. Like there are 20 terrible things in a budget. You fight 3 or 4 of them really hard, and you're like, yeah, we won. And then the day after, and that's all the paper covered. They remove this really bad part. And then the next day you're like, oh my God, there are like 16 horrible things that were in that budget that we didn't even know about. And so I call it the 80-20 strategy. And here's the worst part about it. Again, my book, I don't want to just be dark. I go through all the ways that we need to solve this stuff, but
it doesn't stop it from being dark. I hate to break it to you, David.
But this is all happening. Now multiply this out over many states. Every time something passes in one state, all the other states are like, oh, look at that. We'll do that too. So you have this push in all these states. And that, like the Don't Say Gay bill that made so much noise in Florida and Disney. Well, the minute that passed, Ohio, the same bill comes up in Ohio. So it's like on steroids. If it happens in one state, all the other states model. And there are institutions that are set up to share all this stuff amongst these different politicians.
So this past week, our sponsor, CN, devoted a day to celebrating safety. Workplace safety is an industry grail. We've all seen those signs in factories and on industrial sites, tallying accident-free days. But when your job is deploying some of the most powerful machines on Earth to move millions of tons of cargo over thousands of miles every year, safety becomes a baked-in prime directive. CN is responsible not just for keeping its 20,000-plus railroaders safe, but also all the cities, towns, and villages along its North American network. Anyway, CN's safety celebration honored several employees who've gone the extra mile of ingenuity, so to speak, like the track inspectors in Manitoba, who began carrying cans of spray dye, using it to expose rail defects that might have caused a serious accident had they gone unnoticed. The railway also spotlighted 42 individuals who managed to serve 35 years or more without a single injury. One of them is a fellow named Tim Stanbaugh, who started with CN in Alberta in 1976. He remembered that back then, safety was something you learned about on the fly. You figured it out for yourself. He's still a railroader, and when he collected his award, he said CN's modern training programs and safety standards now set the standard in the industry and are widely copied. After 46 years in railroading, Tim had two signal pieces of wisdom. First, he said, think about what you're doing. Impulse can be deadly. Second, he said, if we keep improving, luck will have no place on the railroad. Luck has no place on the railroad. How's that for an excellent slogan? Congratulations to them all. Okay, wait a second. You explained this in a more nefarious way in the book, and I'm still not sure I fully grasped it. But you essentially said that there's a working group of professionals who work with the state legislators and maybe even officials of the state off-site to develop a policy. And then they'll road test it in Ohio. And if it works in Ohio, they'll export that to all the other states that are part of this sort of world or network that are out there. But it is not the state legislators thinking up this stuff themselves. It is professional consultants working for the money who tell them what to think. Is that right?
Yes. They basically, I talked about privatization. They've privatized the legislative process, okay? And they started doing it decades ago. So they fly these legislators in a state like Ohio, they're there for 8 years. They don't know that much when they start, a lot of them. And they literally are flown. A lot of them are from small towns. I love these small towns. I don't say to be negative, but they're from small towns. This is the best gig they're ever going to have. And they get flown to fancy conferences all over the country where they sit down with private entities who have paid big money to be at the same table with these legislators. The legislators don't have to pay. In fact, they're given, quote, scholarships to fly to these places. Can you imagine? This is an elected official, but it's a scholarship as if they're a student, which is exactly what they are. And they go to these meetings, and they all shove around all the model legislation. And they have votes literally at the working groups of the private entity. And then they all fly back to their states. And guess what? The legislation shows up in their states. And the very people who are the private side, they fly to that state and they testify on behalf of the legislation. They have literally privatized the legislative process. It's sick. And it's all over, and it really is working. And that's why, again,
many states have virtually identical laws on these subjects, right?
Yeah. And again, going back to the title, if a law passes and is successful, then it's, that worked. That's a model law. That's what happened after the Stand Your Ground passed in one state. All of a sudden, every state has it. On the flip side, if something blows up because it just is too controversial.
Firefighters and police.
Yeah, exactly.
Firefighters and police.
That was your example. In Ohio, they included in the attack on collective bargaining, an attack on the fire and police unions. That was a disaster. Police and fire, and I was part of this campaign to stop this thing. Police and fire leaders all over the TV for months, just beating the hell out of that bill, was a disaster. Never again have they included police and fire in their attacks on collective bargaining at the state level. So they learn from their successes and model them. And if something blows up politically or legally, they just rewrite it and then they spread it around. So again, I wish the name of my book, Laboratories of Autocracy, were just a cute title. It is exactly how they're behaving. They're always learning, and they learn quite quickly. That's why drop boxes I talked about. They didn't care about drop boxes 3 years ago, but they saw that black voters were using drop boxes at high numbers. So within months of 2021, all around this, they're always correct for their failures. They know that drop boxes cost them in the 2020 election. They immediately start banning them for the next election. And so they're always learning. And by the way, not to get too negative, they'll learn from January 6th. They will learn that the next time, don't wait till the day in Congress. Take care of the electoral problem in the state long before it gets to Congress. They'll even learn from that. So the message to Democrats is you better be learning too. And you can't be fighting the last battle. You need to know that they're actually adjusting already for what they did wrong. And they are now doing it at breakneck speed.
I take a slight detour here and just ask you about the minority vote and their efforts to suppress the minority vote. Is that because minorities vote Democrat solely, or is that because it's part of what I believe I'm witnessing, which is the last stand of white America?
It's both, clearly. You can't deconnect the two. We have in this country, and I try and go through this in the book, and this is why this effort, its censorship is so dangerous. What is happening right now is absolutely consistent with hundreds of years of American history. Whenever there is a diverse democracy in our country that emerges, where especially Black Americans begin to play a meaningful role in our democracy in a coalition that becomes the majority. And this happened after the Civil War. I go through in the book. There is always a brutal and fierce white backlash to keep that from happening. And people, this is where I really worry about the history, being censored. In the 1870s, there were more Black voters registered to vote and voting in Louisiana than white voters. People don't know that. And there were Black elected officials at all levels, Congress, mayor, statehouse, you name it. And the white Democrats essentially at the time freaked out. And that's when they began saying, well, it sounds like today, voter fraud. That's when the KKK emerged. That's when, they started to bring back Confederate symbols, not right away, but after. And violence and voter suppression and deregistration through state houses, once again, it was through state houses in the 1880s and 1890s led to 80 years of Jim Crow. And all those Black elected officials were gone. 140,000 Black voters in Louisiana in the 1870s, 30 years later, were 900 voters total in the whole state. They decimated a robust and diverse democracy. And what was the latest iteration of that? Barack Obama winning. Barack Obama winning, not just because of his historic, what his ascent meant, but the Obama coalition winning. A coalition of young, diverse voters saying, hey, we're powerful. We're going to turn Ohio blue. We're going to turn the country blue. We're going to turn Florida blue. That led immediately to 2011, intense gerrymandering and voter suppression in any way you can think about it. Early vote, purging, you name it. And that's why I really resist one thing, and you talked about at the beginning. This is not because of Trump. This began before Trump. Trump was part of it. He was a representation of it. The attack, the white backlash to this diverse majority, the attack on democracy, the most recent iteration began before Trump ever thought he was going to run for office. If Trump had admitted that he lost the election, it would have continued. They would go after drop boxes just the same. And if he were locked up tomorrow,
they'd still do it.
January 6th, it would continue. And I think Democrats and the media make a huge mistake when they believe it's about Trump only. Of course, he's terrible. And of course, what he did is terrible. He needs to be held accountable. But the deeper threat is bigger. And when we only talk about it in terms of Trump, here's my worry. We give cover to many people who don't look or sound like Donald Trump, who are attacking democracy. And this happened in 2020. You had a lot of voters vote for Joe Biden and then a bunch of Republicans the rest of the way down their ballot. And those Republicans are the very people who are voting to get rid of drop boxes. We're doing that crazy false audit in Arizona, some of your listeners may know about. They've been attacking democracy ever since, but because we had on sort of a no Trump glasses, we only cared about Trump. And the attack on democracy is bigger and deeper. And we have to make that shift. It's got to be a deeper commitment to democracy beyond. And I love what the January 6th Commission is doing. But to the extent it only is focusing on Donald Trump, it may also fool people into thinking that other people who are attacking democracy aren't so bad, when in fact they're doing the same attack just a little more subtly than Donald Trump did.
So to get back to the strategy laid out in your book, okay, like everything in my view in American politics, it all comes down to money. This is a big, sophisticated organizational and intellectual operation you were describing.
Yeah.
Who's writing the checks?
Great question. Some of this started out 30, 40 years ago as a sort of pro-life operation, and it fizzled. That group I mentioned that's organizing. But once it became clear that they could do a lot of this work around issues like climate change, then it became an investment that paid off many, many times over. And that's when you see, the Koch brothers and other major energy interests and other players getting involved, where for them, you heard my process. Think of, it's not even lobbying. If you're sitting in a room writing the laws, that's better than lobbying. So it's become a major investment.
Actually, you said the Koch brothers think the actual individual politicians are irrelevant.
Totally
You
irrelevant.
just put anybody in the position that they've created and they're going to act the right way.
Correct. The incentives are all there. And we see that. We've had 3 different speakers of the Ohio House for the last 6 years. One resigned, 2 resigned in scandal. The next one just does the same thing. The incentives are what the Koch brothers care about. Democrats want to always find the next Barack Obama, right? Some incredibly dynamic person who's going to make us all so excited. And when we find that, wonderful. The Koch brothers could care less. They could care less. The guy, their person can be as dumb as a rock. They can be the least. They can have a scandal. As long as they do what the incentive structure has them do, they're fine. And when they're done, they could care less. They've done their role and they move on. And I actually think this is why the Koch brothers they didn't like Trump that much. Why? All they want is someone not to screw it all up. And Trump in the short term kind of did. He sort of screwed it up in some ways, in the way that he was so over the top. He wasn't very subtle in what he was doing. But no, I think that they don't care at all, because what do they need? They need democracy subverted. And once they have that, all the people behave the same way. And what they want is hundreds of people in all these states behaving the same way, which is happening.
But is there a lot of real mainstream corporate money involved in this exercise?
Yes, and
because there was a hint of glimmer of hope, I thought, in the book, where you outlined how, okay, so maybe a company is in its own interest funding this shit in Alabama, but you could make them pay a terrible price for that in California.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes. I believe, and this is part of my mission, there are a lot of companies not like the Koch brothers who aren't as conservative. But because of traditional sort of government affairs mindsets, they give to these statehouse politicians. They give to Ron DeSantis because they're thinking, well, they're in charge. We have to work with them. And my point is, remember this thing with Disney? Disney all of a sudden about 2 months ago got caught up. They had given a bunch of money to people who were attacking LGBTQ kids. And all of a sudden they try to pull away, and Ron DeSantis is now punishing them. And my message to corporate America, to Procter & Gamble down the street here, or Kroger, they're based here. What happened to Disney is the inevitable outcome of your support of extremism. If you support these undemocratic officials, you are all going to find yourself having to answer to your workers and your customers. Why are you supporting extremism? In Ohio, for example, the Ohio Chamber of Commerce the other day endorsed 3 candidates for the Ohio Supreme Court, all of whom I can tell you very clearly would support a ban on abortion here. The Ohio Chamber of Commerce. Do you think it's helpful for companies like Procter & Gamble and Kroger, when they're trying to recruit from around the country to be in a state, that those young women recruits will not even have the basic choice? It's terrible for them. These companies rely on talent from all over the country. And I think they're going to figure out quickly that these undemocratic and extreme legislatures are in the end terrible for their long-term futures in the states where if they happen to be headquartered in Missouri or Ohio or Florida. So my hope is they'll figure this out, because again, the Disney story, Ron DeSantis is trying to punish the single biggest company and draw to his state. They become mini autocrats. And so what if they're willing to do that? That's going to happen everywhere. And so what I would say to companies over time is get out of the extremism business. Invest your dollars in things that end gerrymandering or lift democracy. Disney, don't invest in people who suppress the vote. Why don't you have everyone who enters your park register to vote? Why doesn't Procter & Gamble put a QR code on everything of Charmin where people can use their phone and register? Start investing in democracy, because your business will go downhill over time in many ways, and your customers will hate you if they see that your money is being spent on abortion bans, on guns being everywhere, on and on and on. And these businesses are, some unwittingly, not all, some are unwittingly supporting the most extreme extremism because they're helping these undemocratic state houses exist. They need to get out of that business. And they're going to figure it out. Hey, they're going to see what Disney's experienced.
You know, in Canada, we have eliminated big money from politics. You can't give a lot of money. Corporations can't give any money. Wouldn't that be popular in the United States? Like, wouldn't an ordinary citizen, like in Canada, that was completely uncontroversial. The constituency of people who stood up and said, no, companies should be able to donate large amounts of money to political parties or politicians was zero.
Yeah, I mean, we are because of Citizens United and the First Amendment, I don't think you're going to ever, while I'm still running around with energy, have that. Here's what so in my book, I don't try and take on every challenge because I want to get to things we can solve. Here's to me the answer. We are seeing, when motivated the right way, massive explosions of money through small dollar giving. Again, back to Kentucky being across the river. The challenger to Mitch McConnell raised more money than Mitch McConnell did because of small dollar viral giving. My friend who's now the head of the DNC, Jamie Harrison, ran against Lindsey Graham in South Carolina. He raised almost $200 million. Lindsey Graham didn't raise that much. We can compete with a lot of the money through the power of the small dollar online donation. Here's what we have to do. We got to be smarter about what we get motivated about. And here's the bad news. The race against Mitch McConnell was not a good expenditure of $100 million. That didn't make any sense. He wasn't going to lose. Just because we hate somebody doesn't mean that's where all our money should go. We need to start channeling.
You probably shouldn't have gone to Beto O'Rourke because you actually don't even care who the governor is particularly, right?
I mean, Beto winning in Texas, if he could win, it would be a big thing. At least he's running for governor, okay? A governor can change things, change some of the things I'm talking about. But the idea that we give $100 million to beat Mitch McConnell over the river here, at the same time, there are 20 state house districts in Ohio where no one's even running against little extremists. That's a sign that people need to read my book and don't see what's happening. And we need to come up with mechanisms, and I'm trying to do this in Ohio, where we say to people, sure, give $50 million to that campaign against McConnell or $20 million, but take a lot of it, like the Koch brothers have done, and invest it in state level races, because that's where democracy is being destroyed right now. And one of the biggest mistakes we make by only focusing on a few federal races every year is we are leaving the extremists, giving them free passes everywhere. And what happens when they get a free pass? They get more extreme. They get less accountable. We need to have people supported running in all these places all the time. So at least if someone passes a crazy bill about guns or abortion or something else, at least they have an election. Can you imagine the high these people must feel that they pass laws that are so toxic and they don't even have an election? I mean, it's on steroids. It's catnip for these people. So I think the money is actually something that's there if we're smart. But right now, the one side, because this, my entire point of my book is to say, those of you who care about this country, you must wake up to the fact that democracy itself is under attack in states. That's the front line. And everything you do in politics needs to reorient towards that. And that includes your giving. Of course, we want Tim Ryan to win the Senate election in Ohio. I'm helping him. But don't stop with that. Go help people running for the state house, school board, because that's where the attack on democracy is most fiercely being waged. And until people see that, we'll keep losing this battle. So the money's there. And when motivated, it's enormous. But it's going to a very narrow set of places that often are not the front line of the battle. And that's a mistake.
It's all so interesting. And I would hold the book up if I had it, but I read it on Kindle. Why don't you hold it up one more time? David Pepper, Laboratories of Autocracy. And
is this on video as well as?
It is. Okay. There we go. We're on YouTube.
All right.
And people watch
that one painting behind me is kind of a point of barrel Georgia Bay image. I paint on the side to get rid of my frustration. So
I don't want to tell you what I do. Okay. I don't want to stop the conversation though. The book has chapters at the end that detail a lot of ideas that David has for fighting back and combating this. And I would encourage you to read that if you're interested. But I really wanted people to understand the diagnosis. Now, David, if I could, while I've got you on the line, there's just a few other things about American politics I want to chat with you about.
Okay.
Right?
Go for it.
So first of all, I'm going to completely disregard the entire thesis of your book.
Okay.
And ask you, who's going to be the fucking Democratic nominee for president?
I think it'll be Joe Biden.
Come on.
I do.
Don't sit there and lie to me. The man can't hold a set. He's too old. He's too old. He can't win.
Funny. I've heard this more and more lately in a way that's very, that really sticks out. But I think it'll be Joe Biden. I don't see right now, unless he denounced he's not running, I don't see another person who right now is, the national figure that if he were to step aside, you'd have a long primary. And I don't see right now a figure, although there's some great figures out there that's ready to go for that. And so they have a lot of work to do. But I still see.
I can't believe he's electable.
That's my honest and goodness response is I still think it's Joe Biden.
Well, that's depressing because I can't believe he's electable.
Yeah. Well, I'll just say this: people thought, and I was the chair of the Ohio Democratic Party, so a couple of years ago, my answer would have been what I needed to say. Now I'm just saying what I think. Joe Biden people thought that before that primary, and he won. And I honestly think, this is my honest opinion, and there were a lot of good people in that primary. I happen to be friends with some of them. I'm not sure anyone else would have won that election but Joe Biden in the general election. I don't know if any of the other candidates, as much as they were talented, would have been ready to beat Donald Trump and gotten some of the votes that Biden got. Now, he's got a lot of work to do to get back to the confidence, and his numbers are not where they need to be. But I do worry that there isn't sort of there's some good people out there. I happen to go to law school with Cory Booker. He's incredible. And he still should be in the conversation long term. But I just think that as much as people talk about this, I still think that against a very tough 24 candidate, I'm not sure there's any other national level Democrat that's.
That's why I asked. I don't see an obvious choice either, but I just find it very, very hard to believe that enough Americans are going to look at Joe Biden in 2024 and say 4 more years.
Okay. No, and I will say I've been at a few events. I'm in Ohio. I do my thing. So I'm not out as much as I was when I was chair. I have been at a variety of functions. I was in New York over the weekend. I have heard that more and more in a way that has been frankly surprising from Democrats concerned. So I think if he is going to do it, he needs to come out and show. Today, by the way, he said, and I'm glad that he wouldn't, because if you go through my book, the filibuster is being used by those attacking democracy, and Democrats need to stop going along with that. Biden came out very strongly today, taking a swipe at the court and saying we should not have the filibuster for privacy. But I think he's got to up his game to show to dissuade the kind of concerns that you and others have. But it clearly is a growing concern. I agree with that.
Okay. Roe versus Wade. That decision by the Supreme Court has many, many, many Canadians in a dark place about this. I don't know why Canadians care so much about what happens in the United States, but we do. And it affects us emotionally, and people are really upset and angry. In Canada, when I run campaigns, if I can convince people, and it requires some effort to convince people that it might be true, but if I can convince people that a politician does not believe in a woman's right to choose an abortion, most women will not vote for that candidate. No. Just on that basis alone, right? It's a vote determining issue all on its own, plus it's a litmus test. If that's your perspective on choice, you probably think a bunch of other things I don't agree with you on as well, right? This has not been a voting issue in the United States for 50 years because it was a right guaranteed by the Supreme Court. So Republicans could run against it, and nobody was voting on that basis. Republicans could fundraise and organize on it, but it was not a voting issue. Now it's a voting issue. Is it going to be a vote determining issue in Ohio? Will women in Ohio react the way women in Canada react?
For a guy from another country, you just summarized American politics perfectly. I know a lot of pro-choice Republicans who would vote for pro-life Republicans because they thought they're not going to really do anything. They're not going to get rid of it. It's all just being used to get the vote out. And now it's real. And by the way, this also exposes what I've said. Now people will see, my God, it's the statehouse that's going to determine my life. And before, the court was there to protect. And with Biden saying today, he believes that the filibuster should not be used to block legislation to protect choice. He just made this. Now, by the way, I know you're concerned about him, but this was a good move. He just made this November a referendum on the issue. And a referendum on an issue that 60% of Americans agree with us on. So I think if the other side's going to be tweeting about inflation, which we all know is bad around the country and the world, and I don't want to underestimate that is hurting people. But a referendum, even in a gerrymandered world, a referendum on abortion is exactly what Mitch McConnell does not want. And I think especially if they call a vote and it's like if it's 48 Democrats and people start to realize, wow, if I vote for Tim Ryan or John Fetterman or Val Demings in Florida, and if they win, we get 51 votes to vote for it, that could change the outcome in what had worried Democrats we thought to be a sleepy election. Well,
a devastating election. Everybody's been girding themselves for a beating in the midterms,
correct.
Right?
And it could still be, they come with it granted, but you make it a referendum on this. And if you say, one or two Democrats winning, and by the way, John Fetterman looks like he's in good shape in Pennsylvania. Warnock is a very good candidate. So the Senate is one that we can win. But if voters are thinking that way, and right now if you're effective, they should be thinking that way. You might have an up or down vote on abortion that you've never had because, like you said, people just didn't think it was central. The pro-choice side at least didn't. Oh, they're not going to really do anything. It's here. My mom's in her 80s. She'll tell you, when I was a kid, it was awful. But most younger women just assume that's sort of the rules, and it's not going to change. And by the way, what's another big problem in midterms for Democrats? Young people never show up. Well, now there may be a heck of a reason to show up that normally they wouldn't see. Normally it's about Obama and the presidency. Well, in the midterm, who cares? Well, all of a sudden, young women are saying, my God, this could be my last gasp at locking in a federal law that will protect me in my future. So I think that if it becomes a referendum on that, it does change the game for the Senate, for races like those in Ohio. By the way, one other place it changes, in Ohio, you see in my book, state Supreme Courts are all of a sudden incredibly important because a state Supreme Court could say that an abortion ban violates a state constitution and forget the federal. So we have in Ohio 3 Democrats running for the state Supreme Court. If we win one of those seats, we have the majority. It may all of a sudden add energy to that race that no one normally would think about. So it does upend politics in a way that I think Mitch McConnell would have preferred this happening in 9 months than right now. And so when you're looking at races like Tim Ryan against this goofball J.D. Vance here in Ohio, when you look at some of the other close Senate races, this does create a huge amount of energy and focus in what people worried might be a pretty lethargic year for Democrats otherwise.
Right. Cool.
But again, it's June. So it's a long time, and Democrats need to work very, very hard to kind of
the economy is tough. It's going to be tough not to keep the economy from being the top issue in the election.
It is. But you start there are going to be horror stories. And this is why it can't just be about November. Every official in power right now needs to be taking actions also to help women. I mean, people had appointments canceled who are now going to be giving birth. There are women at risk of dying through certain types of pregnancies that are at risk right now. Sadly, there are going to be horror stories about what the court's done. And officials need to be fighting to protect these women right now. If all Democrats do is talk about voting, they're gonna look really bad. And it's not the right response. One, protect the women, millions of women who are in harm's way right now and in danger right now. And then 2, obviously show people that come November, you can make a difference. But I think that first part is going to this is not going to just disappear. You're going to have horror stories because these bans in places like Ohio are no exceptions for rape or incest. They are going to push. Which is
such a tiny minority opinion in the United States, right?
Oh yeah, it's toxic. Like you said earlier, on a fair playing field, if you stand up and say I'm for the rapist baby being delivered, no matter what, you would lose your office in a heartbeat. And people have. A couple years ago, you clearly are paying enough attention. There were candidates in Indiana and Missouri who were favored, and they said things like, "Well, I'm okay with rape not being they lost in Indiana and Missouri.
Yeah.
Those are still losing positions, excuse me, but it's hidden in these state houses because of gerrymandering. But now we're having a straight up vote yes or no on this. If that's what it becomes, I think that the year could shake things up more than normally. And I ran twice statewide Ohio in the midterm where we had the White House. These are normally very brutal years for Democrats. Right. But this may be the one thing that shakes that up.
Right. Okay, my last question before I got to let you go is I'm riveted to the January 6th hearings. I'm reading the American media and I see that Democrats are reacting in the ways I would expect to the January 6th hearings, but who gives a shit about Democrats? Is this breaking through with any Republican voters in your perspective?
Yeah, I've seen some polling that suggests it is. I mean, I think I think it means it's less likely that Trump will be their nominee. I think it's going to get worse in the future hearings. I saw one poll out of Missouri that about 70% of Missouri Republicans thought the election was stolen. And after the first couple of hearings, it was already down to the low 50s. So I think it's moving. And I think you're going to, again, this is both good and bad. The attack on democracy is bigger than Trump. So if all of them come around and think, man, this guy is insane.
In fact, perhaps the most clownish of the various attacks on democracy.
If they can conveniently get rid of him and replace him with someone who's a little more intelligent in his attack on democracy, they'll make that trade. And that's why I think that this may also give some momentum to that. I mean, all of a sudden Fox News is showing it. The Wall Street Journal is writing op-eds about it. That's a tell. Hey, they're still a hardcore Republican. They're about attacking democracy, but this guy blew it. He's insane, and he's such damaged goods. I think if you reran Biden, Trump in 24, I think Biden's got a good shot of winning it. That may be less so with other candidates. They know that as well. So, but I also think it is, it's the first time that there's, the biggest problem in American politics, one of them is the Republican elected officials who know better never say anything. So for 2 years, people like my senator here, Rob Portman, a moderate Republican, they have sat quietly and allowed Trump to say big lie, big lie, big lie. These hearings are the first time there is a loud presentation of what nonsense that is. It's the first time the echo chamber has been interrupted. And so I think it's been whatever happens to Trump, it's been very healthy that there's this incredibly effective presentation by Republicans like Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger.
I'm worried about her life.
I mean, what's that?
I'm worried about her life.
Yeah, no, but good for her with all whatever she's hearing, she doesn't back off. And shame on all the others, mostly men, who hide. Our democracy is on the line. I don't agree with her on a lot of things, but good for her. Shame on the cowards. And what have we learned for the last 10 years? If you don't stand to a bully, they win. And why these Republicans, Kevin McCarthy, Rob Portman, Mitch McConnell, cannot learn the lesson. Donald Trump entered the primary for the 2016 election as a freak show. And none of them stood up to him. And because they didn't, he went from freak show to this main event. Now he is their party. And they still won't stand up to him, even though most of them know that it's all nonsense. But I do think this hearing has been an interrupting of the monopoly of information in that party, which is, we didn't win the election. I'm sorry, that Biden won the election. They don't believe it. So I think it has interrupted, the Fox News and right-wing talking points that really never stood up to Trump. Well, now Liz Cheney is with enough evidence that, you're not going to win over. Basically, if you go back and look at the numbers, it's always about 30% that's in this extreme land. It has never been a majority. This may make it even lower. And the minute it goes a little lower, that's when they get rid of Trump. And by the way, Trump's endorsed in a lot of these primaries. He helped J.D. Vance here, but in a lot of these primaries, he hasn't done that well. And so, I do think that to the extent it's creating churn on the Republican side, I think in the end, it is a good thing, even if it means Trump is less likely to be the candidate.
Yeah, his friend Herschel Walker is going down in Georgia by the looks of it.
I hope so.
And I hate a lot about American politics, but perhaps nothing as much as making me cheer for a Cheney.
Yeah. It is a shock when you think about it. And I will say, she's voted against voting rights bills. She's voted for other things that I just don't like. And I do worry that if done the wrong way, and I think this is kind of how she's taking it, she's turning this only being about Trump.
Yeah.
Okay. And that's dangerous. Although he needs to be held accountable, and I'm glad, but everyone else needs to be saying, and I tweeted this in response to her speech last night, never forget this is bigger than Trump. This will outlast Trump. If he's locked up tomorrow, it will continue. She is taking it in a narrower direction for a variety of reasons. One, hold Trump accountable. Here's my problem. If you don't hold Trump accountable, then everyone else after Trump will keep doing the same thing. So we need accountability, whoever was part of it. So yes, we have to hold him accountable. But do not narrowcast this as if Trump's the only threat to democracy. It's a lot bigger than the threat he poses.
Right. Terrific. David, thank you for writing this book. Thank you for your leadership on this issue, and thank you for coming on this podcast to explain it to my listeners. Laboratories of Autocracy, David Pepper, and as he said, follow him on Twitter. Super interesting guy to follow on Twitter. I would like to thank my presenting sponsor, TELUS, and our sponsor, CN Rail. I'd like to thank all you Herle Burly-ites for listening or watching, and of course, David Pepper for joining us. And we'll see you in a couple of weeks for more Herle Burly.
Again.
All right.
Thanks, guys. Take care. That was fun.
Take care. Thanks a lot.